The year was 1883, and the silence of the high plains was a living thing. For Eleanor Prescott, it had a weight and a texture, a constant presence that had long since replaced the easy companionship of her husband, Arthur. His voice, once a sturdy anchor in the vast emptiness, was now just a fading echo she sometimes strained to hear in the mournful cry of the wind as it swept down from the mountains, combing its invisible fingers through the tall, sun-bleached grass. Her world had shrunk to the dimensions of their homestead, a small, sod-walled cabin that was cool in the summer and a constant battle to keep warm in the winter, a sturdy barn, and 160 acres of land that promised everything and gave only what could be taken by force of will and sweat. Grief had its own routine. It rose with her in the pre-dawn chill, a cold stone in her belly. It sat with her at the small, rough-hewn table where she ate her meals alone, the chair opposite hers, a stark monument to absence. It walked with her as she tended the chickens, milked the lone cow, and worked the small vegetable garden that was her concession to hope. For 2 years since the fever had taken Arthur, this had been her life, a cycle of work and weariness, punctuated by a loneliness so profound it felt like a physical ache. The land was an unforgiving master, demanding and indifferent. It had taken her husband, and in return it offered only a raw and brutal beauty that felt more like a taunt than a comfort. Her neighbors, the closest a half-day's ride away, had urged her to sell the land, to return east to the soft green hills of Ohio where family waited. But to leave would be to admit defeat, to let the silence win. It would be a second burial, consigning not just Arthur's body, but the entirety of their shared dream to the earth. So she stayed, her resilience a quiet, stubborn thing, like a hardy prairie flower clinging to a rock face. She learned the rhythms of the land, the language of the sky. She hardened, her hands growing calloused, her heart encased in a careful protective shell. It was on a Tuesday in late summer, under a sky the color of faded denim, that the routine was broken. She was riding the fence line at the far western edge of her property, a place she rarely visited, where the land began to crumble into rocky arroyos and canyons. The air was still, heavy with the scent of dust and wild sage. Her horse, a steady bay gelding named Atlas, suddenly shied, his ears twitching, his neck arched in alarm. Eleanor quieted him with a firm hand and a soft word, her eyes scanning the terrain. And then she saw it, a splash of color against the dun earth that did not belong. Dismounting, she tied Atlas to a gnarled juniper tree, her hand resting for a moment on the worn stock of the rifle she always carried in its saddle scabbard. Caution was a reflex, a second skin worn by anyone who lived this far from the flimsy protection of the law. She walked slowly, her boots crunching on the dry soil. It was a man, lying face down near the edge of a shallow ravine. He was Lakota, that much was clear from his buckskin clothing and the single eagle feather tied into his long black hair. He was utterly still. There was no sign of a struggle, no visible wound from this angle, no arrows or bullet holes in his tunic. His bow lay a few feet away, unstrung, and a quiver of arrows was still slung across his back. He looked as though he had simply lain down to rest and never risen again, perhaps a snake bite or a sickness that had stolen his strength too far from his people to seek aid. Kneeling beside him, her initial fear gave way to a solemn sense of intrusion. She gently, respectfully, turned him over. His face was stern even in death, his features sharp and proud. He could not have been much older than she was, perhaps 30 years of age. His eyes were closed, his body already succumbing to the rigid finality of its state. There was a small, almost invisible puncture mark on his leg, swollen and dark. A rattlesnake, then. A lonely death, just like her Arthur's had been in its own way, surrounded by the four walls of their cabin, but a world away from any doctor who might have saved him. She saw not an enemy, not a savage as the fearful whispers in distant towns would have it, but simply a man, a son, a husband, a father perhaps, another soul lost to the unforgiving wilderness. The thought of leaving him here for the coyotes and the vultures was an offense against something deep and elemental within her. Death was not a stranger to her, and she knew its sacred requirements. It demanded dignity, it demanded closure. Looking at the still face of this unknown warrior, she saw a reflection of her own loss, a shared humanity that transcended the barriers of language and culture. Her grief, so long a private, solitary burden, reached out to acknowledge his. The decision was made without conscious thought, an impulse born of a weary but still beating heart. He would not be left to the scavengers. Getting him onto Atlas was a grueling task that tested the limits of her strength. The man was solidly built, and the dead weight was immense. She strained, her muscles screaming in protest, the sun beating down on her back. Sweat stung her eyes and slicked her hands. Twice she nearly gave up, her breath coming in ragged sobs of frustration and exertion. But the image of circling buzzards, their dark wings stark against the pale sky, spurred her on. Finally, with a last, desperate heave, she managed to drape his body over the saddle. She walked back to the cabin, leading the horse, the grim procession moving slowly across the vast, silent land. She laid him out on a clean canvas tarp in the shade of the barn. The work that followed was a ritual, performed with a quiet, focused reverence. She fetched a bucket of water from the well and, with a soft cloth, gently washed the dust and grime from his face and hands. She noted the fine, intricate beadwork on his moccasins, the smooth, worn feel of the leather ties in his hair. In a small pouch tied to his belt, she found a collection of dried herbs and polished stone esmol, personal treasures that spoke of a life and a belief system she could not know, but could respect. Her gaze fell upon the large wooden chest at the foot of her bed inside the cabin. It held her few precious things, her mother's lace, a few books, and the good linen sheets she had been saving. They were meant for special occasions, for a life she and Arthur had planned but never lived. Without hesitation, she went inside and pulled one out. It was heavy and smelled faintly of lavender. It was the finest thing she owned. Wrapping the warrior's body in the pristine white sheet felt like a final, necessary act of honor. It was a sacrifice, a piece of her own forsaken dreams offered up to a stranger. As she worked, she spoke to him in a low murmur, the first words she had spoken aloud all day. "I don't know your name," she said, her voice rough with disuse. "I don't know your people, but you were a man of this land. You deserve to rest in it, not upon it. May your spirit find its way home." The words felt inadequate, but they were all she had. The digging was the hardest part. The prairie soil was packed hard and threaded with a tough web of grass roots. She chose a spot on a small rise behind the cabin, a place that caught the morning sun and overlooked the vast expanse to the east. It was near where she had buried Arthur. For hours she toiled, the rhythmic scrape and thud of the shovel, the only sound besides her own labored breathing. Blisters rose on her palms and broke, but she did not stop. Each shovelful of earth was an act of defiance against the cruelty of the world, a testament to the fact that even in this desolate place, a single person could choose compassion over indifference. By the time the sun began to bleed orange and purple along the western horizon, the grave was ready. She gently lowered the shrouded body into the earth. There were no prayers she knew that would be right for him, so she stood in silence, her head bowed, offering a moment of shared humanity. Then, slowly, she filled the grave, patting the earth down with the back of the shovel until a small, neat mound was all that remained of her day's sorrowful work. Exhausted to the bone, she did not bother with supper. She washed her hands and face at the basin, the water cool against her hot skin. The cabin was dark and quiet, the silence now heavier than before, filled with the presence of her actions. She sat in her rocking chair, the rifle across her lap, and watched as the last light faded from the sky and the stars emerged, cold and brilliant in the inky blackness. A profound weariness settled over her, a feeling that went deeper than mere physical fatigue. She had done what she felt was right, and now there was nothing left but the night. It started with a flicker of light on the northern ridge, so faint she thought it was heat lightning. But then another appeared beside it, and another. They were not random flashes, they were torches. Her blood ran cold. She stood up, her heart beginning to hammer against her ribs like a trapped bird. Moving to the small window, she peered out into the darkness. The ridgeline, previously a simple dark curve against the star-dusted sky, was now dotted with dozens of fires. And as she watched, more appeared, spreading along the horizon in a silent, inexorable line. They were coming over the rise, not in a chaotic rush, but in a slow, deliberate wave. The faint, rhythmic thud of countless hooves began to vibrate through the hard-packed earth, a sound that felt less heard than felt in the pit of her stomach. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her. They had found him gone. They had tracked him here. They would see the freshly turned earth and believe she was a killer, a grave robber. The stories she had heard in town, stories of brutal raids and swift, merciless vengeance, flooded her mind. She was one woman, alone, in a flimsy wooden box in the middle of an ocean of grass. The rifle in her hands felt as useless as a child's toy. She ran to the door and threw the heavy bar across it, her hands shaking so badly she could barely guide it into its bracket. She did the same with the wooden shutters on the two windows, plunging the cabin into absolute darkness, save for the thin cracks of light that revealed the growing army outside. Peeking through a sliver in the shutter, she saw them. It was not dozens, it was hundreds, a sea of mounted warriors, their forms silhouetted by the flickering torchlight. They were forming a vast, silent circle around her homestead, their ponies stomping and blowing softly in the cool night air. The sheer scale of it was terrifying, beyond anything she could have imagined. 1,000 men, it seemed, had come out of the night to lay siege to her tiny corner of the world. Yet, there were no war cries. There was no hail of arrows against her walls. There was only the dreadful, organized silence. They just sat there on their horses, torches held high, their faces impassive and unreadable from this distance, their collective gaze fixed on her cabin. The silence was more terrifying than any scream. It was a weighted, patient silence, full of unspoken threat. It was the silence of judgment. Section. The night became a crucible. Every creak of the cabin's timbers, every gust of wind sent a fresh jolt of terror through her. She sat on the floor, her back pressed against the wall, the rifle held tight against her chest. She did not cry. The fear was too deep, too primal for tears. It was a cold, hard knot of certainty that her life was over. She thought of Arthur, of his face in the final moments, peaceful and distant. She thought of her family in Ohio, who would never know what became of her. Her act of compassion, her small gesture of dignity for a fallen stranger, had brought this doom upon her. The irony was a bitter pill in her throat. Hours crawled by, each one an eternity. The torchlight outside never wavered, a constant, flickering reminder of the ring of death that surrounded her. She drifted in and out of a state of exhausted, hyper-vigilant dread. She imagined the door splintering, the warriors pouring in. She imagined a fiery arrow thudding into the sod roof. But none of it happened. There was only the silence, the waiting, the crushing weight of 1,000 silent accusers. She must have dozed, for she was startled awake by a change in the light. Through the cracks in the shutters, the black of night was softening to a bruised, grayish purple. Dawn was coming. Her body ached with tension. Her mouth was dry as dust. She pushed herself up and dared to look outside again. They were still there, unmoving, 1,000 silent sentinels ringing her home. But as the sun's first rays touched the eastern horizon, something changed. A ripple of movement passed through the vast assembly. A pathway opened in the circle, and a single warrior rode forward. He was a man of immense presence, his shoulders broad, his face a mask of stern authority. He wore a magnificent headdress of eagle feathers that trailed down his back, a clear sign of his status as a chief. He rode to within 100 feet of the cabin and dismounted, his movements fluid and deliberate. He handed the reins of his horse to another man and began to walk towards her door. He was alone, and he was unarmed. Eleanor's heart was a frantic drum. This was it, the moment of reckoning. He was the chieftain, come to pronounce her sentence. Her mind raced. She could stay hidden, wait for them to act. Or she could face them. The same instinct that had made her bury the fallen warrior now pushed her forward. To cower in the dark felt like a betrayal of the very principle she had acted upon. She had done nothing shameful. She would not die in shame. Taking a deep, shuddering breath, she slid the rifle onto the table. Her hands, slick with sweat, fumbled with the heavy bar on the door. It groaned in protest as she lifted it. The hinges squeaked as she pulled the door open, stepping out onto the small porch into the cool morning air. She squinted in the new light, her eyes locking with the chief's. He stopped about 20 paces away. He was even more imposing up close, his face etched with lines of grief and wisdom. His dark eyes were not filled with the hatred she expected. They were filled with a profound, questioning sorrow. He did not speak. He simply looked at her. Then his gaze shifted to the side of the cabin, to the mound of freshly turned earth. He held her gaze for a long moment, a silent interrogation that seemed to strip away all pretense and peer directly into her soul. Eleanor stood her ground, her terror slowly being replaced by a strange sense of calm. She had made her choice. She would accept the consequences. She met his gaze without flinching, her chin held high. Finally, he spoke. His voice was a low rumble like distant thunder. He spoke a single word in the Lakota tongue, a word she did not understand, but whose tone was one of query. Then he raised a hand, not in threat, but in a gesture toward the grave. He followed it with a few words in heavily accented, broken English. "You did this?" he asked. Eleanor found her voice, though it came out as a parched whisper. "Yes." He took a slow step closer, his eyes never leaving hers. Why? It was the question she had been asking herself. Why risk so much for a stranger, an ostensible enemy? She thought of Arthur, of her own gnawing loneliness, of the simple, unassailable belief that had moved her. He was a man, she said, her voice growing stronger. He died alone. No man should be left to the wolves. He deserved respect. She gestured towards the grave. "He is wrapped in clean linen. I buried him next to my husband." The chief's stern expression did not change, but something in his eyes flickered a brief, infinitesimal shift. Surprise, understanding. He looked from her face to the grave and back again. He saw the exhaustion etched on her features, the blisters on her hands, the truth of her simple, declarative statement. He saw the small cabin, the lonely garden, the evidence of a hard life lived alone. He stood in silence for what felt like an hour, though it could only have been a minute. The fate of her world hung in that silence. Behind him, 1,000 warriors waited for his signal. A single gesture could unleash a torrent of violence that would wash her and her small homestead from the face of the earth. Then, he did something she never expected. He brought his right hand up, placing it flat over his heart. He held it there for a moment, then gave a slow, deliberate nod. It was not a gesture of forgiveness, it was a gesture of profound acknowledgement, of thanks. Without another word, he turned and walked back to his horse. The assembled warriors watched his every move. He mounted, took the reins, and raised his hand. But he did not signal an attack. He pointed back toward the ridge from which they had come. What happened next would be seared into Eleanor's memory for the rest of her days. The chief did not lead his men away immediately. Instead, he guided his horse in a wide arc, riding past the small grave. As he passed, he reached into a pouch at his side and dropped something onto the mound of earth. A single, perfect eagle feather. Then the next warrior rode by, and the next, and the next. In a slow, solemn procession, every single man guided his horse past the grave. Some left a small token, a painted stone, a lock of hair, a braid of sweetgrass, a carved piece of wood. Others simply paused for a moment, their heads bowed in respect. It was not a retreat. It was a funeral. They were not just honoring their fallen brother, they were honoring her. They were including her in their ritual of grief. Eleanor stood on her porch, tears finally streaming down her face. They were not tears of fear, but of an overwhelming, heartbreaking sense of connection. The vast cultural gulf that separated her world from theirs had been bridged by a shared understanding of loss and dignity. She, the lonely settler widow, and they, the fearsome Lakota warriors, were united for a brief, sacred moment in a common act of mourning. It took nearly an hour for the last warrior to pass. They disappeared over the ridge as silently as they had arrived, the thunder of their hooves fading back into the prairie wind. The sun was now fully risen, bathing the land in a warm, golden light. The silence returned, but it was a different silence now. It was not empty, it was not threatening, it was peaceful, resonant. Her small farm, which had been a prison of loneliness, now felt like a sanctuary. She walked over to the grave. The simple mound of earth was now covered in the tributes of 1,000 men, a mosaic of stone, feather, and herb, a testament to an impossible event. She knelt, her fingers gently tracing the edge of the eagle feather the chief had left. She was still alone. She was still a widow on the harsh frontier, but the crushing weight of her isolation had been lifted. In performing an act of kindness for one man, she had received the respect of a nation. She had faced down 1,000 warriors and found not an enemy, but a shared humanity. And in the vast, quiet heart of the plains, she was no longer entirely alone.